everybody, welcome back to The Hobby Musician. You're joining us today as we are right in the middle of our current building project, but don't worry, if you want to get caught up on any of the previous episodes, or if you just want to jump around to the different phases of this build that maybe most closely match what you're doing, click the link at the top right now and that'll take you to a playlist where I've just arranged only the episodes in this building process. Well, today's episode is all about the neck. We're going to talk about everything from start to finish of how we got to this point with this neck, with one exception. The only note that I have for us is I am not going to talk about how we achieved this angle in the headstock. As I was kind of preparing everything and thinking through all of the stuff we're going to talk about for this video, I realized there's a lot to talk about that goes into making an angle in this, and it warrants its own episode. So after you're done with this, click in that playlist that we were talking about a second ago, and you can see its own episode devoted completely to how we were able to achieve, kind of in a DIY fashion, that angle on that headstock. Okay, without further ado, where do we start with something like this? Well, in true fashion, in true hobby musician fashion, we always are taking the approach that we try to use salvaged or scavenged materials wherever we can. And the same is true when it comes to making the neck. So in the same batch of wood that we kind of got, which were leftover module desk parts that we used for the body, in that same batch there were these long square strips that I think originally are used. You can kind of mount one to one side and one to another side, and you can kind of, install shelves or cabinet doors, those kind of things. But there was a whole pile of them that were left over and were just going to get thrown away. So I went through and I was able to find the right lengths. Some of them were longer than others. You can see here some of them had notches cut in, others didn't. There were different, slightly different colors, lighter shades, darker shades. So I just collected up everything that I thought I could use, and I started to laminate them together. Now, we've done this a bunch of times on the channel, and laminating is just the process of taking small pieces of anything and gluing or adhering them together and building up to a bigger thing. So I took a lot of these pieces, just found the ones that were relatively straight, and you can see in this picture that I just was able to glue in between and clamp them all together to start building boards. Now, I noticed after the first clamping that the vertical dimensions of this was not tall enough. These are not thick enough to fully encompass what we need for the neck. So you can see here I actually made two identical boards, and after they were done gluing, I pulled out the thickness planer and I just very lightly buzzed off any of the glue that had kind of splooged out of the top, and some of the boards maybe had kind of warped a little bit or moved a little bit in the gluing. What I did was then I recreated perfectly flat surfaces on the top and the bottom of those boards, and I took one board and laminated it, glued it to the other board, and now I had a thick enough piece. So from there, what do? Well, we had the neck blank, and in fact, this is where we're gonna pause, and I'm gonna re-mention that one video. This is actually the point where I spent time creating this angled headstock. So again, we'll jump ahead, finish out this video, and you can jump ahead to the next one to see how we did that. But after that headstock was created, now we can go back and do all of the other shaping and stenciling and tracing that we need to do to get the neck in this shape. So I have the angle, I have the bulk of this neck blank. The first thing that I need to do, after I traced back on the shape, I got out my templates and I traced back on the profile of the neck, I needed to cut in the route for my truss rod. So truss rods are the metal bars that go they're in the middle, runs right down the middle, and you can see the access hole that we got to cut in up here. And they allow you to make adjustments to the curvature of the neck when everything is said and done. Well, they have to be cut in and installed inside. So you can see here, I actually set up a little DIY router rig to help me be very perfectly straight. I had a board that I knew was straight that I clamped down in my workspace. And then I just went and I put the router at one end and lined up where I needed the bit to be, and moved the guide board until that was lined up. Then I went all the way down to the other end of the neck And again, move the guide board. So now front or finish and start, we're both lined up with this straight board. So now everywhere that I move that router up and down, it follows that perfect line that I drew right down the middle to follow the truss rod. So then a little pro tip here, when you're cutting your own truss rod routes, I highly recommend incremental cuts. So I don't measure the truss rod, I don't do the whole depth that I need in one pass. I'll put the router bit out there 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, and do a little pass, and then come back and then incrementally move that router bit deeper and deeper, so that at any one time I'm not running the risk of like burning out the bit or chattering and jumping out or anything like that, and you end up with a real smooth process. And with everything clamped in place, there's no worries about getting out of that straight line. Okay, well, we've got the truss rod cut in. The next thing to do is to install the fingerboard. Now, full disclosure, I keep going on and on about how we salvage wood and we scavenge and we do all this kind of stuff. There is one part to any instrument build that I don't scavenge. There's only one piece of lumber that I purchase, and it's the fingerboards. I know from personal experience how important the fingerboard is. You have to have a good quality, solid, reliable, dependable piece of material to use as a fingerboard. So I went on and ordered just a fingerboard blank. Now, I don't care too much about the kind of wood it is. The only thing I cared about for this particular build was the shade. So I actually went to the sale, the clearance section, and I looked at whatever was cheap, and I tried to find the darkest shade, because later we're going to talk about all these markers that you see here. I knew I wanted something dark because of some of the cosmetic visual things I was going to do later. So I ordered that fingerboard, and when it arrived, I was able to then line it up, and I used the method outside. So I traced on it where the profile of the cuts were going to be. Well, then there was leftover, there was overhang at the top and the bottom. So I went in, and after I clamped it on, I went in and drilled outside of where the neck was. I drilled a few pilot holes where I was able to install screws, so that I pulled off the fingerboard and we put our thin layer of glue. We covered the truss rod with some masking tape, so you don't want to get glue down in the truss rod, but cover the truss rod with some masking tape, get a thin sheet of glue, and then when I came back and I lined up the screw holes that I drilled into this, now the fingerboard is going to sit perfectly where we had it placed, exactly in line of where I needed it to be. And then I could come in with my clamps, I could squeeze it down, and you can see all the clamps in this picture, just up and down the neck, to make sure that I was going to get a really good glue bond all the way up and down this thing. And I knew that no matter how hard those things were squeezing, it wasn't going to slide sideways, up or down. And those guide screws really help with that. Okay, well, after all of that's said and done, we need to then go back and clean up the shape. We need to get the nice smooth lines all the way up and down the side. So we're back to the router. We tape on. I use that masking tape and super glue trick to tape so that I can put super glue on the masking tape, and that helps us top and bottom tape back on the template for the top, and then it's back out to the router. I took just an edge flush trim bit and went along up and down the sides, being careful not to carve into the headstock, and I was moving this around to make sure that we now have a really well defined, you can see all the rounded edges that kind of come down here in this profile, and the taper as it goes up the neck, and all of that is now done. The last thing in terms of shaping that we're going to talk about is how we did the back, right? We all know we need a nice, comfortable, curved profile of a neck to make the instrument playable. So the technique that I use for this is actually a first for me. I had seen a lot of folks be doing something like this on other tutorials, but the technique I use is kind of the faceting technique. And I was watching a lot of videos of the folks over at Crimson Guitars, and they do this really well with a lot of their necks, and that's where I learned it from. But what you do is you draw, with a long straight ruler, you draw a line down the center of your neck blank. Then you measure from the center line to the edge, you measure how far that is and divide that in half and make a mark. So you put another mark that's halfway between the center and the outside. Then you do that down here and you connect the line. So you have a center line and a halfway line. Well, then you turn it on its side. And at this point it's still rectangular, so it's still a chunk. Well, you measure the width and you do a line halfway. So you have a halfway mark and a halfway mark on the bottom and on the side. And what you can see here in this time lapse is by taking like a grinder, I'm using just an angle grinder with a sandpaper disc on it. If you then sand it so you make a flat edge that connects the halfway mark and the halfway mark, now you kind of have an angle. Now it's flat on the top and it's two flat sides. Well, it's not curved yet, but it's kind of more of a trapezoid, like a weird trapezoid shape. Then this technique continues over and over again. Now you measure the width of the flat space you just made and make a mark in the middle. You measure the remaining width and you make a mark in the middle, and you go middle, 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 sanding, sanding, sanding. Each time you do that, you're making smaller and smaller faces, and those faces eventually start to get to the point where it's still rough, but it is a curve that you're carving into the back. And at a certain point, you then put down the power tools. At a certain point, I had so many facets that now I could just go back to hand tools. I used a file and kind of filed down the edges, and then with some sandpaper finished it off, and you end up with a beautiful symmetric curve that's really, really comfortable in the hand. And it's kind of all done with hand tools. So I was really pleased with how that all turned out. You can see here that I made sure I was lining everything up so that the dark strip, the darkest of the starting strips, was there right in the middle. Okay, now to talk about the front. Well, how do we get this kind of cool effect? Well, we said at the beginning of this project, this base is going to be a fretless base. Now, there's a lot of things you can do. You can leave the fretboard completely blank. That's what a lot of fretless bases are, but I wanted something visually popping because I also know what the overall visual paint job is going to be on the body. I wanted to carry some of those colors up the neck. So what I did was I took my fret saw and I cut in. I measured out, I got the spacings, I calculated all the spacings that I needed, traced them out, and I still cut with a fret saw where the frets would go if I was going to install the frets. I used my flat Forstner bits to kind of drill these circular holes as if I was going to put in little fret markers, those little circle fret markers. You can see on the side, I did just do a normal installation. I've got the white plastic rod markers down here that we installed just like we normally do. Drill the hole, put in the rod, a little dab of super glue, put the rod in, cut it off, and then you just sand it down flat and you get these really nice side markers. But for the front, after I had the channels and after I had the holes, that's where these guys come in. If you look over here, I went out and got some fluorescent neon enamel paints. This is just stuff that I picked up at the local craft store. That I think the brand name is Testers here. Hey, and like everything, quick reminder, nobody sponsors these videos, but if you want to find any of the tools or any of the products we use, I do have some Amazon affiliate links that I can put down below that you can click in and check out any of this stuff. But these enamel paints dry incredibly hard, and they're super fluorescent, and they kind of match the colors that I'm planning to do for the body. So with these paints, I got a few of these disposable syringes, and these are plastic. You can see here, these aren't even needles. These are just plastic applicator tips that are super, super skinny. And so I took these syringes with these little applicator tips and I pulled up the various colors, and you can see in this time lapse, I just went through and very carefully squirted or injected the paint into the grooves of the frets, as well as pooled it up. The easier part were these circles. I just kind of pooled up the paint in there and let it dry. Now I had to do several coats. When paint of any kind, enamel or acrylic, whatever, when paint dries, it actually shrinks up in volume. What I wanted to do was I wanted to have the material in these frets actually raise up enough so that it matched the fretboard when I come back and radius this. So I had to put a few coats because it would then shrink down and I could see that it was below the level of the wood. So then I would come back after that coat had dried, suck up some more paint, and then go through and reapply it until I kind of had paint coming out the top of all these things, and it looked really kind of messy, as you can see in this picture. But the benefit of this, the good news is, if you have enough that comes out, now when it comes time to radius the fretboard, when we get out our radiusing block, and you saw our earlier episode of how we had to even make the radius block itself because the neck was too wide for commercial blocks. Now when I sand down the flat surface that we had been working with, it sands off any of that extra paint, and you can see here, this is the final product. This is what it looks like after you sand down and create kind of one consistent surface after getting that paint in there. Now, the last thing we did to get ready for this is we oiled it. So after everything, the curve was cut in, the sanding was done, the front of the neck was all finished, then we just came back with our Tru Oil that we use for all of our projects, coat after coat after coat. I think it got up into the, I don't know, teens, 12, 13, 14 coats of Tru Oil, thin coats. Some people talk about doing 3 or 4 coats, but they really lay it on thick. I like to go real thin, let it dry. Real thin again, let it dry. And I like to do a lot of coats that way. Buff it out with some sandpaper. Buff it out with some very fine steel wool, quadruple zero steel wool. And you get this beautiful shine. You can really see the grain that came with this fingerboard, as well as you can kind of see that the oil brings out the colors that were already there. You can see down here, this is the joint that's going to be glued in into the body, so I didn't do a lot of oiling there. But you can see that's the original color of the strip, but if you move up here, you can see how much darker it looks. That's kind of the cool part about using the Tru Oil for these projects. So really here at the end, from start to finish, from building up our very first kind of neck blank from all of these scrap pieces of wood, through all of the cutting steps, the shaping steps, and finally with our crazy fluorescent paint colors, this is how we've gotten our neck to this point. And in a certain sense, our neck is kind of done. The headstock is waiting. It's going to be getting the same kind of paint job treatment that the body is. We're going to do all that at once. But otherwise, we have a neck that's ready to go into our kind of crazy custom single cut base. So I hope you got something out of that episode. And as always, I want to thank you for watching. And until next time, play on, my friends. Play on.